Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. My name is Fatima Abul Asrar. I'm a senior analyst with the Washington Center for Yemeni Study. Thank you all for being here today and for what promises to be a thought-provoking discussion on the implications of the incoming Trump administration policies on Yemen, the axis of resistance, and the Gulf. Um, Before I start, wanted to introduce the center. We are an independent, nonpartisan organization, nonprofit. We're committed to fostering rigorous research and informed dialogue on Yemen and bringing about Yemeni voices to discuss issues around Yemen, the Gulf, and the Middle East. We're proud to be entirely funded by the generosity of our private donors from the Yemeni American community. So today we have three excellent speakers who will help us examine how a potential Trump administration could reshape Yemen's conflict and the regional dynamics, from Houthi maritime operations to Iran's strategic calculus. The implications stretch far beyond Yemen's borders. Our panelists will help us understand what's at stake for the US policy, Gulf security, and regional stability. We have Mohammed Salih, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is an independent researcher and consultant. Mohammed holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and has nearly 2 decades of experience writing extensively on Middle Eastern affairs and US foreign policy for leading international media outlets, think tanks, and journals. We also have Mustafa Naji, who is joining us from Paris. He is a former Yemeni diplomat and researcher specializing in social studies and in political transformation in Yemen. He has a master's in Francophone literature from University of Paris 8 and a public administration degree from France's National School of Administration. He has authored studies and translations in French and Arabic, and he's currently completing his doctorate in political sociology, examining political socialization within Yemen's political Islam movement. And last but not least is Mr. Adam Clements, who is a former military attaché to the U.S. diplomatic mission to Yemen. He served in numerous leadership and operational military assignments, including in the Pentagon and overseas as a military diplomat during the Obama, Trump, and Biden administration. In his Pentagon roles, Mr. Clements provided critical support to senior defense leaders, including the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Army Chief of Staff, shaping important strategies around the Middle East and the region. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, and I wanted to start with Mohammed Saleh, given your recent article that you wrote about the Middle East conflict and on the upcoming or incoming Trump administration, we see the Iran-Israel confrontation often as a fulcrum of the Middle East tensions. How do you see the current developments in Syria and Iraq influencing the broader trajectory of this confrontation, particularly as the US transitions from the Biden administration to the Trump administration? Are we likely to witness policy continuity or a significant strategic difference?
Well, thank you so much, Fatima. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with you and the other distinguished panelists. Let me first of all say that, without the military campaign that Israel had launched in the last couple of years against Iran and its axis of resistance, especially post October 7th, we would not have been where we are currently in the region. At the current moment, at the current administration, is sort of coming to the end of its term. Iran is not in a very good place. The sort of the balance of power, if you like, has one way or another tilted in Israel's advantage. This was not something that was necessarily predictable a couple of years ago, but in the aftermath of the October 7th, attacks by Hamas and the conflict in Gaza and in southern Lebanon and the heavy blows that Israel delivered to Hezbollah and also to the leadership of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps in Syria, and also, the sort of more clandestine operations it has conducted inside Iran. All of this has brought us to a point where Iran is and its allies and proxies in the region are significantly weakened. And so what this has created is really is a sense, a very palpable sense of panic among the Iran-led axis. It's very visible to whoever is closely paying attention, but there's also at the same time, a sense of defiance, especially in the wake of the rebel advances, the anti-Assad opposition in Syria. So the opposition's advances in Syria against Assad forces and their takeover of Aleppo, which was really unpredictable, very difficult to predict until a few weeks ago, have really dealt a quite significant strategic and also psychological blow on top of what has been happening, within the sort of the confines or framework of the Israeli-Iran confrontation. We are now seeing a redrawing of the lines of conflict lines in Syria in a way, that puts Iran, Assad, and Russia, and also the network of regional militias led and directed by Iran at a very disadvantageous point. In Iraq, one outcome of this has been really a sense that the conflict in Syria bears similarities to the period between 2012 to 2014 and the rise of ISIS. That has generated quite a lot of panic, but that has also led to a mobilization among the pro-Iranian groups, the so-called Popular Mobilization Forces, or the Hashd al-Sha'bi. At the moment, the Iraqi armed factions are actually the only groups in the broader Iranian axis of resistance who have the manpower, who have the resources, and who are geographically positioned in a way by virtue of their proximity to Syria that makes these groups the only groups within this broader axis who would be capable of doing anything. But they are also very much concerned because they have seen that Israel has been quite relentless in targeting Hezbollah, and they have denied the media reports that they have sent forces over to Syria. Those forces do not seem to have really made it to the battlefronts in Hama or other parts of Syria at the moment, and there is a real concern that if they were to, join that, the battle between Assad and his opposition, that they would be targeted, by Israel. This is especially, the risk of this is higher for the IRGC commanders and advisors who would be deployed to Syria. We have seen in the past that Israel has been, quite successful and surgical in targeting the senior IRGC leadership in Syria. So all of that really puts, the Iranian-led axis, as I said before, in a quite disadvantageous position. And the expectation is also that with the coming of the new, or the second term of President Trump, that that the pressure is going to increase on Iran and its proxies and allies across the region. And so all in all, the picture from Tehran or for those groups that are allied with Iran, the big picture really doesn't look good. They have lost the momentum that they had a couple of years ago. Let's remember that up until at least prior to the October 7th attack by Hamas, Iran looked, like a very major regional power with, its sort of influence and control and dominance extended over four Arab majority countries in the region: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and in the more recent years, Yemen. At the moment, even though that influence exists and that network or that access has not been really dismantled. However, the Iranian-led access is really in a much, much weaker position compared to a year ago.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mohammed, for that overview. And it's kind of interesting because also prior to October 7th, the Islamic Republic was not in a good shape domestically. With the unrest, with the revolution from people, after the death of Mahsa Amini, and the Islamic regime looked at its weakest internally. And I think that by activating their network and the axis of resistance in Hamas and Houthis in Yemen, kind of really was a major deflection from the weakness and the internal weakness that has been seen there. Also, there probably was, lack of expectation that the U.S. will react and that the Biden administration will react. So just wanted to get from you like your sense like with the incoming administration. And you talked about this in your article that, there's often this tension between interventionist and isolationist impulses. Wanted to, get from you a sense on how do you think that this might play out in the Middle East, particularly with Iran's positioning and the role of the axis of resistance in shaping the new security architecture.
Well, the struggle or the tension between the more interventionist or activist elements or, currents within the incoming administration and the broader Republican Party and the more isolationist, side of the party would be really very interesting and important to watch. A lot of people, are trying to make sense of how, the incoming Trump administration's policy would be toward the region. I think, we should not necessarily look for a linear line, right? We shouldn't be looking for a flat line. There would be most probably a trajectory of ups and downs depending on who is in charge at any particular moment of time and how, the policies of the individuals, at the level of, for example, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, or the envoy for Iranian affairs, whether inside the State Department or if there's going to be a presidential envoy for that purpose. So the back and forth between these major figures in the future administration, and also how their views, sort of runs against or in line with President Trump's own vision in terms of how to conduct his Middle East policy. So all of this would really, I would say we would probably be witnessing an interesting interaction. At the moment, the people who have been picked or nominated for some of these senior positions, such as the National Security Advisor, Congressman Mike Waltz, or the Secretary of State nominee, Senator Mark Rubio. These are people who are known for having espoused or holding very strong anti-Iranian views. They are also at the same time very much pro-Israel and pro the states in the Gulf Cooperation Council. So if that were sort of to be taken as an indication of what we should expect at least for a while sort of a maximum pressure campaign to be imposed on Iran. This is what, these individuals have advocated in the past. And it is quite likely that they would stick to those positions in the future administration. But another really important question is, just sort of judging from what we saw in the first Trump term, would be the stability of his cabinet, in the sense whether, the current people who have been selected or nominated, whether they are going to stay in their positions for the entirety of the term or not. So, depending on how sort of the internal dynamics of the future, cabinet and administration are going to proceed, there can be shifts in the policy, but overall, at the moment, Iran really finds itself in a real dilemma. They are very much worried based on, on Trump's policies during the first term, especially the last couple of years of his term. They are very much worried about, a sort of reimposition of the maximum pressure campaign, the rigorous enforcement of the sanctions, which were not as rigorously enforced under the Biden administration. So that gives a lot of sort of creates a lot of concern among Iranian officials and leaders, and will bear directly also on the economic conditions of the country, and the sort of the livelihood of the average Iranians. And as you said, there have been multiple waves of protests inside Iran in the recent years. So, the regime is very much vulnerable in terms of, a rekindling or renewing of those protests. And if you sort of couple that with the pressure that it is facing externally in places such as Syria, Lebanon, with Hamas in Gaza, in Yemen, and potentially in Iraq as well, it's not going to really make the Iranian leaders feel happy or comfortable, and their choices are also very much limited. There has been talk of a possible decision, to go for a nuclear weapon, which will not be easy. But given what has been happening in the recent month in the region, and the heavy campaign by Israel against the Iranian-led Axis, there is a growing sense in Tehran that their best sort of bet or insurance policy would be to acquire a nuclear weapon, and hoping that that would restore deterrence vis-a-vis Israel, and potentially, ideally, sort of compel the United States to also engage in talks and negotiations with the regime. But that also could really turn, the regime in Tehran into a pariah regime, something akin to North Korea. It would very likely lead to its regional isolation, further isolation, even stronger measures from the United States, Europe, and other Western countries. And so they are not in a very good position, but they are also trying to be pragmatic about it. And they have signaled that they are willing to engage in talks with the Trump administration. We saw that, the former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who is currently the Vice President for Strategic Affairs in President Pezeshkian's administration, he wrote an article for Foreign Affairs, basically reiterating the Iranian willingness to engage in talks. They see that as a pragmatic and reasonable step to take, and appear to be engaging in good faith. And so, depending on how that would be reciprocated by the Trump administration, we might either end up with a possibility or scenario where there might be talks towards some sort of a JCPOA 2.0, But that's also really easier said than done because during the first Trump term.
Let me interrupt you here because I want to go to our other panelists with the GCPOA 2.0. I think that's a very interesting perspective because one of the reasons why it failed initially is, the conditionality that Iran, the Trump administration viewed that Iran needed to abandon its ballistic missile program and its support for its axis of resistance, which definitely did not happen. But let me move to Adam. As Mohammed set the stage in terms of like just giving us an overview of the complex realities of the dynamic between Iran and Israel and the United States. Wanted to ask you, Adam, from a diplomatic and a military and economic perspective, what do you think that the new administration should prioritize for both the stability of the Red Sea, Yemen, and also, Bab el-Mandeb? How might the priorities and what's happening on the broader level uh, shift based on these realities, and it's so important to kind of also understand this, is that when the United States and the international coalition intervened recently through military airstrikes on Houthi. Um, they do so, but it kind of affects the dynamic on the ground because, one problem is that the United States often is kind of like maybe not sending the right message through these actions because they haven't really intervened in any way in support of the Yemeni citizen who's also suffering from the Houthi presence in Yemen. So the intervention sort of like says we're concerned about the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb, but not so much about the stability of Yemen and the stability of the country. And wanted to know also from your perspective, what can the U.S., our incoming administration do better in order to address these concerns?
Thank you very much, Fatima, and thank you very much again to the Washington Center for allowing me to come. And so let me go through a lot of these, try to unpack a lot of what you just stated. First, I'd like to establish an underlying problem statement and some underlying facts, assumptions, and context that are important as we address those diplomatic, information, military, economic perspectives. So first, I think the U.S. needs to clearly define in the international community, define the problem and trying to find ways to limit the source of the Houthi strength of its military power, interfering with the free flow of commerce, information warfare, and its legitimacy within the context or limits of the regional and global political military dynamics. Specifically, U.S. global resource allocation. I'll talk about resources here in just a minute. And then how you approach these problems depends on the glasses that you're wearing, depends on the lens in which you view these. Next, I'd like to identify, we talk about a lot of interest, of country interests, of U.S. interests, of regional interests. I think the U.S. has to very clearly define what are vital interests, what are interests in which the U.S. would deploy, and the cost could be American blood, money, et cetera, and resources versus interest. So in the past, it's been AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, because it's threatened the program, threatened the homeland, as opposed to free flow of commerce, which hasn't threatened the homeland. So I think identifying those interests and which ones are vital versus just general interests. Next, with resources, I want to be very specific about resources. And what I mean by resources, all of these conflicts in the world, Ukraine and Russia, Israel with Hezbollah and Hamas, all of those require a large amount of resources. Diplomatic resources are much cheaper than, say, military resources. So when you have Patriot batteries, when you have carrier strike groups, destroyers, when those are extended, the people that man them, the equipment itself, when they are delayed and when they're used, when unprogrammed use and deployments, and that creates second and third order effects many years down the road in the future. and that also affects how the U.S. approaches global problems. And so I think the U.S., the incoming administration and the Pentagon really have to look at the allocation of those resources, and then contextually how they could or wouldn't be used, or should or shouldn't be used in the Yemen context. I think next there also has to be a very clear identification of political aims and goals and what's attainable. Be clear and be clear of that, and try to avoid mission creep as much as possible. As far as some more specifics in the diplomatic, information, military, economic front, from a diplomatic standpoint, a lot of these overlap. I think that point 1, 2, and 3 is to stop the conflict in Gaza. We have some type of in Lebanon. This is a positive development, but stopping that conflict. Why from a Yemen perspective, it feeds the Houthi narrative. It's absolutely been a part of their narratives, and Fatima, you've and others in the call have had lots and lots of experience in this. It also affects, as well, I said, resources from a diplomatic standpoint, also from a military standpoint, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But that also leads into the next points as far as the other countries' view of the region, and then Yemen is part of that. And so I think this is a good point to emphasize Saudi Arabia and Iran's relationship. Under the first administration, Trump administration, there wasn't an open dialogue, or at least a formalized dialogue between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There is now, absolutely leveraging those discussions, those lines of communication between Iran and Saudi Arabia to try to lower the temperature, to try to have a dialogue and discussion. This doesn't mean, of course, that Iran will cede to any of these areas where it tries to play spoiler, as it has in using and providing weapons and capabilities to the Houthis. But this is absolutely a vital part and a very important part of this diplomatic realm, and also the engagement that we've seen in the past in the state of Kuwait and the Sultan of Oman, and their roles in trying to be interface of third parties with Iran and with the Houthis, particularly Oman has created a very important role. Next, as far as, and last I'll state as well, from a diplomatic standpoint, under the Biden administration, Tim Leonard King was the U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen and supporting the U.S. diplomatic mission to Yemen. I think that should absolutely be something that's sustained, and just giving additional diplomatic influence and emphasis and resources to trying to find solutions and communication in the conflict. Next, from an information standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, the Houthis have really used the Gaza conflict as part of their information campaign, both domestically and part of their international legitimacy. So turning off and stopping that conflict would help create, or at least remove, some of that use, or at least some of that opportunity that the Houthis have used. This also plays from a U.S. standpoint or international standpoint, re-examining ways from a cyber standpoint, from an information standpoint, of how do we confront these information, the weaponization that the Houthis use of information. I think also that goes into a military aspect, or military aspects. The Houthis have definitely used, as they have been for many years, in their dogma and their narrative of countering the great Satan in the U.S. and in Israel, and using and borrowing some of those narratives from Iran. So taking Israel also out of some of the narrative, and also from a military standpoint, I can talk about that a little bit as well. But specifically, from our challenge from a military standpoint, going back to the Obama administration, has been to increase or not to increase U.S. military involvement. It's always a double-edged sword. And so I think the administration will have to look at their rules of engagement, how it uses intelligence, precision targeting, precision use of its military resources, both of how they work and are used and implemented in the short term and long term, where I talked about military manpower, warships, etc. And so, again, when the Gaza conflict stops and we're able to get a ceasefire there, that allows U.S. Central Command and the Pentagon to relook within the region, within the Middle East, of how it uses resources, and the context of, well, of what resources have been used in the Israel-Hamas Lebanese Hezbollah conflict, as well as in Ukraine and Russia. And we can't deny the use of U.S. resources, of Western resources, ammunition, et cetera, in that conflict. And the Pentagon will have to look at how all of these resources are used and used prudently in the Middle East and globally.
Adam,
Yes.
to this point, to what extent do you think that the incoming administration might work with Gulf allies or even, Yemen Presidential Leadership Council to counter the Houthi threat domestically? I mean, there's so much push from Yemen's government to do such thing, although it's really fraught with so many um, problems. The idea that we don't have a Yemeni army at the moment to counter the Houthis, but still the Yemeni government wants to equip whatever forces that it has to do so with the blessing from the international community. What can you, if you can give us some your ideas on that. But before I have neglected to mention an important announcement, and I hope everybody was able to see this, that we have live Arabic interpretation provided by our colleague Hussam Qaid, alongside closed captioning that's available in English, Arabic, Russian, Persian, and Turkish. So you can just select your preferred caption language. So that was just a house announcement. But yes, go ahead, Adam.
Sure. I think from a U.S. perspective and how the U.S. approaches its diplomatic and military levers, I think that the U.S. still has to work with the Saudis and with the Emiratis of how it supports from a diplomatic standpoint, as they call the Shari'iyya of the legitimate, at least the internationally recognized, rather, Yemeni government. And I think that the U.S. has to be the broker of working with the Saudis and Emiratis because, of course, as many on the call know, the Emiratis have supported many southern secessionist groups. So I think trying to coordinate all of that so that the counter Houthi forces are not divided. I think from a military standpoint, one thing that from a U.S. perspective is very important is when the U.S. in the past pre-Houthi takeover of Sana'a, a lot of the equipment that the U.S. provided, the Houthis took over. And so I think that the Republic of Yemen government has to establish confidence building measures. And they start very small from a security cooperation standpoint, very small, and maintaining proper accountability of transparency, of showing that this weapons and equipment isn't going off on the black market and being sold. So just small ways to boost the confidence of the U.S. diplomatic mission to Yemen and the U.S. government that it will maintain accountability and the proper use of the security cooperation that's being used. So that could be on land, and that could also be with the U.S. with the Coast Guard, for example, the Yemeni Coast Guard. There have been some other very small places where the U.S. and the Yemeni Coast Guard or the U.S. ground, or rather the Yemeni ground forces have established some very nascent cooperation. I think economically as well, this has a huge part with the Saudis as far as how the Yemen government is supported, and I think from a active combat role and campaign, I think that the reason there's no military, I believe there's no military solution in Yemen. The reason I don't think there is because no side, be it the Houthis, the counter-Houthi forces, is strong enough to overcome the other, be it because of geography, because of military capabilities. And so I think the Saudis can work with and coordinate with lots of different entities in Yemen, and also consider how it can at least prevent the Houthis from taking over more territory. This is a very contentious issue. So we're talking about airstrikes and other things as well. So those are some examples.
I agree with you. And one of the things that one of the concern is that we talked about like Mohammed talked about the importance of or looking at the Israeli Gaza situation, and you talked about, how that was important for the Houthis as they used it. They used that narrative to strike ships on the Red Sea and to act on behalf of Gaza, Palestinians, when in fact there were just extremely, it was just a propaganda move from their part to try to gain legitimacy on the ground. The concern here is that if a ceasefire would happen in Gaza, and what we will see is, there's no excuse for the Houthis to continue doing this, but at the same time, all of their weapons and arsenal will be turned inwards into Yemen towards expansion, towards Bab el-Mandeb, and we will, Yemen will be experiencing. I think the turmoil hasn't even started yet domestically. It will start if a ceasefire would happen. So right now, all of this useful distraction is kind of, somewhat driven by this entire axis of resistance solidarity that the Houthis are experiencing, and the role that they're taking on themselves as an axis of resistance member. But the concern is, internally in Yemen, what will happen? But perhaps I'll move to our third panelist, Mustafa.
Before you do that, could I make a couple of final comments before we conclude? I know we're on recent time.
Yes.
The last thing I want to say from a military standpoint and resources, there have been some that have proposed the great expansion of countering smuggling of weapons, great expansion of naval forces. And I have a hard time believing that from a global standpoint of how the Pentagon allocates resources, that this is a useful, a good use, a prudent use of naval resources because of the cost benefit in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that's something the incoming administration really has to look carefully at from a resource standpoint. And because we're talking for viewers, we're talking about how do you secure an area off the coast of California. It's extremely difficult. It's not a perfect answer, but there are other ways I think you continue to pressure and use all your diplomatic your tools to try to find some way to both maintain pressure on the Houthis, but also try to empower other groups. So I'll leave it at that. I know we need to move on for the interest of time. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. So, Mustafa, given this discussion, and the connectedness of everything, we realize that we realize that the conflict in Yemen defies simple solutions. So, given the excellent article that you wrote recently, wanted you to speak to us about how might the incoming administration navigate the complex realities that our speakers spoke about, particularly in, issues of navigating, peace with the Houthis, and the need for a sustainable peace process without necessarily having the Houthis become the party that would have the utmost control. We've seen various UN initiatives taking place, and most of these UN initiatives somewhat ended up empowering the Houthis, and frankly, the UN's hands might be tied, partly because the Houthis are often threatening war and conflict if their demands are not met. So how can we balance all of this? How can the international community and an upcoming administration balance all of these issues towards maybe a sustainable solution to Yemen's internal problem?
Well, thank you, Fatima. I appreciate this opportunity to speak this panel. I'll try to redefine the Yemeni scene, first of all, to understand what is the dilemma, what is the issue that we have. I think that Yemen was mainly left for a decade at least as if it were a regional issue, where the growing risks were underestimated. So the past 10 years have led to the emergence of the new Yemeni realities. For example, we know all that Yemen now is divided between two facto authorities. The first one, which called itself Ansar Allah, properly known by the Houthi movement, which controlled the third of Yemen and especially the capital. And the other one, the international recognized government that we call Sharia, comprising a heterogeneous coalition of political and military forces, united primarily by their opposition of the Houthi. So this coalition within the government reflects Yemen's complex social and political realities, as well as chronic issues that the political dialogue initiated during the transition period failed to address. So usually we say that the Sharia is known by its failure situation, economic difficulties, and corruption, and fragmentation, as well as the Sharia Houthi is the same, because Houthi operates under the religious and political ideology that fundamentally opposed to the republic system. It expects apparent security cohesion through strict control. However, it's plagued by corruption, economic weakness, and dependency on external aid to provide essential services in the sector like education, healthcare, and so the situation is the same in both parts of Yemen economically. The specificity that one side with Houthi now became a threat aboard Yemen, especially since 1 year when they start their intervention under pretext to help to support Gaza. The response from some countries like US and UK, and by the way, Israel, was some airstrikes only. And this kind of reaction did not be translated as a credit for Sharia or a way to a path for a ceasefire or a path of stability. I think the new administration will be facing some realities that new actors in the region became more influential than before. So the Yemeni issue is not easy to address. The second, Yemeni issue became integrated in a regional and international interest and fears and difficulties. It means that Yemeni issue now invites other actors to be engaged. So it will be more complicated than 5 years ago, for example.
Yes, I completely agree, Mustafa. I mean, it's the scene is completely different as we see that the Houthis are also becoming, they have the power of the gun and they have monopoly over swaths, like many people in the north of the country. So, these discussions have long gone, and also we see that the positions and the role of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have decided to distance themselves as well from the conflict, and because they feel that they are threatened by the Houthis and also Iran, without necessarily having the security guarantees that they like. And I think that complicates the issue a little bit. So, my question would be to you is, what do you think, the kind of dynamic between the incoming Trump administration and the Gulf allies on the Yemen issue? And if you think that they would actually favor any kind of military solution even to Yemen's conflict, or if they will stop it from happening?
Well, with the coming administration, fears and expectation are manifestly stronger. For Houthi, they're expecting that Trump will react forcefully, and maybe he will carry out a military action stronger than which was happened with Biden. Inside Houthi circles some rumors that there is a new military campaign, especially in Yemeni coasts. It is a part of propaganda, but it reflects it's fed on the new geopolitical realities. Another side, government hopes that the new administration, Biden administration, will be more involved, and the Yemeni government can get more support and military assistance, something like that. But I think it's not easy to do that because, as we know, historically, Trump will not be involved directly, and historically, he is not for the war. He prefers to have transactional approach, and he will seek someone who will pay the amount for his intervention. So the first thing that Biden should convince Gulf countries to pay, which is necessary of intervention if they want guarantee. Otherwise, he should act and seek a way to engage his credibility, because as he said, that the past administration was not enough credible as we think. So there is two areas, there is two battles that he should to act. The one in Ukraine, I don't know how well he will do. The second will be in Yemen, but he will not be directly involved. That's my estimation. That was Max.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, good.
Great. So Mustafa, like another question that I wanted to talk to you about with regards to also like concern about Yemen's internal, dynamics. There is an expectation. I mean, we all know this by end of the Trump administration. President Trump had designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. This was undone and then reinstated in some other way by renaming the Houthis as a special designated terrorist organization. So, and there is expectations that the incoming administration is going to redesignate the Houthis. We've seen the designation from the Canadian government just a couple of days ago. Before that, other countries are also on the same track to designating them as such. I wanted to get a sense from you, how might this affect the Houthis? Will it actually have any effect on the Houthi movement? Will targeted sanctions do so? And sort of like, what is the effect as well on the humanitarian situation and aid and delivery? Given the fact, I mean, we already know that a lot of humanitarian organizations are not working in the north of the country, and that's because the Houthis have kidnapped a lot of the UN workers, and a lot of UN workers, educators, has had this massive campaign that threatened humanitarian organizations, but still some of them remain. And we want to know, how can this designation affect the humanitarian conditions?
Yes. So I think we have to come back a little bit to talk about the truth. The truth has led to, for me, I think that truth has led to increased suffering. It's paradox, but for me, it's the reality, because funds allocated for humanitarian aid have declined since 2 or 3 years till now. The other side, the legitimate government cannot export oil after the Houthi bombed the oil facilities in Hadramaut and Shabwa. So the economic situation is a very difficult state, but it's not visible till now. And in addition, the Houthi intervention since a year disturbed the political deal anyway. So everything is stuck, economic situation and peace process. For that, I think Yemen will be on the table for Trump. So the sanction, the designation is expected as more as other tools to be taken by Trump. Anyway, American sanctions, possibly through the increasing designation, could be one of the tools employed. But is it really efficient or not? Anyway, every punitive measure entails complexities and side effects. And typically, the designated group works around sanctions to minimize their impact. You know that Houthi is not a state, and their economy works largely by subaltern networking, so it will not be really affected. Ultimately, civilians are the ones who suffer from sanctions. The consequences will be more severe on Yemen because the country heavily depends on remittances from Yemeni expatriates. There is a fragile economic, financial, and economic connecting Yemenite abroad. Sanctions alone would damage this link, unfortunately. If designation is done for its own stake, it is pointless. The designation is a tool to curb the Houthi ability to harm international interest. But if designation is not accompanied by other measures that led to change the power dynamics in Yemen, then it is a meaningless. I think the United States can convince regional actors, as Adam said, support the regional actors supporting the government to change their approach to the solution in Yemen and consider the risks resulting from this kind of approach. And because it doesn't lead to building a state in Yemen and doesn't help to have a reliable partner till now because of fragmentation and chronic problems. So the solution should be, beside designation if it is necessary, is to strengthen the government's capabilities in multiple areas, such the government assumes its responsibilities locally and become an effective partner. I think United States can help to involve Yemeni actors in building the peace process and not ignoring them and just give them a formula of peace in which was coded outside.
Great, thank you, Mustafa. I think we're gonna open it to Q&A. So I'm gonna wait for your questions. But perhaps as I'm waiting for your questions, wanted to ask this for all of our panelists at the moment is, we touch on the complicated regional dynamics, and we'll start by just asking how can the U.S. address Iran's influence in Yemen, to and all external actors actually. So I mean Iran being chief at the moment, given its activation of the axis of resistance. So how can the U.S. address Iran's influence in Yemen to advance peace and regional stability? And maybe I will start with Mohammed Salih.
Well, thanks, Fatima. I think a lot of it will, depend on what kind of relationship we are going to see between the Trump administration and Iran. If there is, a maximum pressure campaign that is aimed at actually diminishing the capabilities of Iran, both economically, but also diminishing its ability to, carry destabilizing activities in the region, that would naturally, extend to Iran's relationship with the Houthis. And at the moment, given everything that is happening in Syria is going to be the primary sort of focal point for Iran. And that might actually also, given, the broader general weakening of the Iranian-led axis, that might create opportunities, for the US, for other regional countries to want to, limit the extent of Iranian engagement with some of the other groups in the axis, such as, the Houthis in Yemen. But it also depends on what kind of conditions, if there is going to be sort of a movement toward a deal between Iran and US in the form of initiating talks. What kind of conditions are going to be there, on whose terms those talks are going to unfold and happen. If we are going to see something similar to the 12 points from the first Trump term, I think that would make it very difficult for Iran, A, to engage in the talks and expect any progress, and B, if it actually wanted to, to sort of go along with those talks in good faith, there might be some sort of compromise, at the end, whereby, there might be some easing on some aspects of Iranian, for example, civilian nuclear program and activities. But at the end of the day, given, that the major concern, or a very major concern of US's regional allies, be that the GCC countries, Israel, and others, is the regional activities of Iran and its proxy network. I think, it's reasonable to expect that pressure will be increased, on the axis, and the individual relations between Iran and some of these groups. And, also not just forget the fact that in Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza are already very seriously weakened, especially in the case of Hamas. So that would probably shift the focus towards some of the other more potent members of this axis, in particular the Houthis and the armed factions in Iraq.
Thank you, Mohammed. Adam, if you wanted to comment.
Sure. I think that even though Mr. Senator Rubio and others in the incoming Trump administration have been nominated, not confirmed yet, yes, they have been hawks, very hawkish and against Iran, but they've also been against China. And so I think there'll come a moment where they have to look at global priorities and where is the U.S. going to put its resources. As to diplomatic resources are cheap. It's the people, it's institutions, but military resources, economic resources, and how are those connected? How are those connected to also what's going on in Ukraine, with Ukraine and Russia? So I really think that's also then geopolitically as well in the Middle East. I find that, frankly, Israel is a strategic liability for the U.S. So then, therefore, how do you reorient some of your strategy to find ways in which the U.S. isn't subject to Israel's war and conflict with multiple countries around the region? Iran is very weak, so does it threaten the U.S. directly in the homeland, as opposed to Russia and opposed to China and long-term threats? So I really think that the administration just has to prioritize things. It's not perfect, but I think these are all ways of trying to look and refocus strategies away what hasn't worked in the past. And there's a lot of emotion involved as well when it comes to these problems, in addition to just the geopolitics as well. And I think all these, the context of what I described with not only China, but Russia and Ukraine, it's hard to ignore. And those were just challenges that weren't there in the first Trump administration. And so I'll leave it there. So lots of things to unpack there of how you reorient or reapproach your policy and what lens you look at it through.
Thank you, Adam. And Mustafa, if you we discussed, if you want to comment on this, and we discussed yesterday kind of like Yemeni's overview of Iran's intervention, and how the international community might have underplayed that for a very long time when, in fact, inside the country, there was just this sense of frustration that this was not seen clearly by the international community. So if you wanted to also speak to that, I mean, and especially given your expertise and studies in kind of political Islam in Yemen.
Yeah, well, I think it's undeniable the connection between Houthi and Iran, even ideologically, but especially military. So the Houthi inspired their force and power from the military aspect, which is provided by Iran. And given to what's happened to Hezbollah, Houthi will see him increasing its rule more and more because they will be the ultimate option for Iran and the region. That's and Houthi driven their rule from their ability to inflict damage and military power. That's I think the Houthi, what they fear most are the Yemeni forces opposed to them more than others, and uh, this is why they are resort to escaping to external rules, and the solution should come from and by Yemenis. It will be less costly if it is made by Yemenis, even to change the dynamic power and the power map in the ground. More the time passes, more the situation becomes complicated, and which the thing that we could do 5 years ago, we would not do 2 years after. I think we should be hurry and have a solution.
Right. Okay, so taking it to the audience questions, we've received a question about U.S. engagement in Yemen that focuses on the role of the Southern forces. So this would be probably to Adam and Mustafa. So such as the Southern Transitional Council, the Southern Security Belt, and the Southern Giant Brigades in Yemen. So these groups demonstrated significant success and a strong stance against the Iranian-backed Houthis. With this in mind, the question is, how should the U.S. approach its support strategy in Yemen? Could these southern forces represent a more reliable and effective partner in combating regional threats? Start with maybe Mustafa, and then we'll go to Adam.
Okay. I think the formula that we have now in Yemen is simply that we have multiple actors. They are efficient because they have bakers. Once, the second because they came from the ground. They have their historical and cultural grievances, but economically they depend on their bakers. So it's a key that we can use to regulate this situation. The second, that or building the peace or process peace or stability, it could be considered as the counterterrorism. We cannot carry out a counterterrorism policy by using the sectarian differences or using understate actors. We should have an official partner that we can carry out responsible, that we can have a good dialogue with them, and we can take him accountable. So I think it's better that we centralize the aid, centralize the effort, and help the Yemeni government to building its capacity to be more inclusive and to be more professional and performant.
Adam?
Yes, I think that a couple of perspectives on these Southern Transition Council forces. I think that the problem is they've also been politically and militarily a threat to Saudi interests and also to Republic of Yemen government, the Sharia interest militarily and diplomatically. They haven't been united. And so the problem is the Houthis, they haven't been able to provide the counter Houthis, therefore, counter Houthi forces have not been able to provide simultaneous military pressure on the Houthis in multiple areas. And so the Houthis, because of geography that they control, and because attacking forces always require more attacking and offensive forces than defensive forces. So the Houthis are able to still address, it could be the Giants brigades or others, and defeat them or address them because they don't have other pressure on other fronts. And so I think the key here is still uniting these desperate counter-Houthi forces politically and militarily. I think the U.S. has a role in this, and I think that the Emirates and the Saudis, I think I don't know where that policy is internal to in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh of where those policies are and how that coordination is. I've seen it firsthand of some of the of maybe not hostile, openly hostile, but just a lack of coordination between Saudi-backed and Emirati forces. And so I don't know if that's still the case. I have a feeling it still is, but I guess those are my hesitancy of that support. And I think from a U.S. perspective, it's going to be very tough from a U.S. policy perspective to support with military equipment, money, et cetera, these forces. It's just not. I think the U.S. government will be very hesitant to do so, and I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of details here.
I mean, and there are a lot of variables on the other side. There are just a lot of variables. And there's also a concern about potential more armament on the ground and what that might mean. So thank you for that. That was a very comprehensive answer. I appreciate it. There's another question for you, Adam, regarding the evolving dynamics between Iran and Russia. And we saw how that played out in Yemen. So considering this relationship of convenience and the cooperation in Yemen, how might this change if the war in Ukraine comes to an end under a potential, or under the incoming Trump administration? And whether if you see their relationship continuing to deepen in the Middle East, regardless of, that outcome.
That's a really tough question to address because I've seen several things of where Russia considered it that it didn't. I don't know because it's one thing to provide military equipment, but it's another thing to provide military expertise and assistance, and the Houthis have definitely benefited from that over the last decade plus of working with Hezbollah and Iran. So I don't know though in the long term how it's in Russia's interest to continue to block another or be a spoiler, I guess, to another waterway in the Bab el-Mandeb. They have problems anyway, and I think also this was you can insert also the question of China here. I think this is actually an element. I don't see there's any political palatability or interest right now in cooperating with China, but China gets a free ride in the Middle East because of the U.S. security umbrella. So the question is, in the long term, is it possible to involve China to have China devote more resources to help with the free flow of commerce in the Middle East? That's very difficult to do. It takes a lot of diplomacy, to try to build a lot more trust than there is now. But this is again something too for China. I don't see how blocking the Bab el-Mandeb in a major waterway is in the interest of China either. Lastly, I'll say as well, I think that we can use other resources in the Gulf with the Saudis, with their interaction with Russia. I think also Egypt. I mean, Egypt has been immensely hurt by the lack of the flow of commerce through the Bab el-Mandeb. And so Egypt is also a way too, because of that they're really looking outside the U.S. Security sphere, that the U.S. can use interaction and diplomacy with other regional states to engage with Russia and ask them and try to push them to not do this, to play any more spoiler role, at least in the Middle East. And that also brings in Russia's role in Syria, the Eastern Mediterranean, and a whole lot of other things that you'd take a whole day to discuss.
Right. No, thanks. The another question, and possibly for Mohammed, Salih, and maybe Mustafa. With Hezbollah losing control over Lebanese borders and key facilities like the airport, disrupting the seamless arms route from Iran to Lebanon, could this development also impact the arms supply to the Houthis through Sana'a airport? If so, how might the Houthis and their backers work to close this gap? So, Mustafa, maybe if you have any insight on this.
The reliance of Houthi on Iran is totally different. I think it's totally different from the way between Hezbollah and Iran. There is no, for years, there is no direct connection. Houthis tried at the beginning to have this connection when a Houthi delegation went to Tehran and signed a contract to carry out a flight, I think more than 14 by week. By the way, there is no a big economic interest between Yemen and Iran. Anyway, I think Yemen, before this war and during this war, is known as a country of smuggling. So the way that weapons comes to Houthi is not directly by airports or ports, but by smuggling, by small points through the sea, comes by many ways. Just remember that U.S. ships and other Western ships intercept every month, maybe every month or every trimester, some small ships who are transporting arms. So the airport is not the main way to receive weaponries.
Thank you. And Mohammed, if you have something to add.
Well, I mean, Yemen is not an area that I particularly focus on, but I would say it really is a question of if there is a will in terms of trying to enforce, sort of such a set of measures on Yemen and on the Houthi-held areas at the airport that you mentioned. I think the likely candidates for that would be either Israel or the U.S., the UK probably. In the case of Israel, I would say they have their plate full with trying to focus on Lebanon and enforcing the ceasefire from their point of view. And also, with things heating up and flaring up in Syria, that's also going to occupy a good chunk of Israel's attention, trying to monitor that situation, seeing if any Hezbollah units would, try to cross into Syria, if there is any sort of back and forth and flow of arms and ammunition across that border between Syria and Lebanon, and also, let's not forget that Gaza is an unfinished business. So, with all of that, I'm not sure that Israel would have the resources and, the capabilities, for example, to be able to focus on the case of Houthis in particular. If there are attacks from the Houthi areas on Israel, we would most likely see retaliation by Israel as we have seen in the past. But I'm not sure that Israel would be the party who would be able to enforce, such measures on Yemen. It might be different with the U.S. if there's the political will under the Trump administration. The sort of the major thing with regard to the Houthis for the U.S. and the international community is really the safety of international navigation and commerce in that region around in the waters around Yemen, be that the Red Sea or further in the Gulf. So I think it's possible that they would want to sort of get tougher on the Houthis, and they probably would. But what the specific and exact measures would be, I think it would be hard to sort of comment on that, at least for me.
No, I understood. But perhaps, and this is a question, for me, kind of like with Iran positioning itself strategically and Gulf states exploring new alignments, what opportunities and risks does this moment offer for constructing a regional security framework? I mean, it's kind of like one of the things that we're constantly thinking about in terms of the evolving dynamic between the Gulf states and Iran.
Right. I think that's an excellent question, and it also goes back to some of the discussion we had earlier, which I wanted to sort of get back to at some point. But what the present moment in the Middle East really offers in terms of an opportunity is the possibility or the likelihood of restructuring the geopolitical and the security reality in a way that would be sort of more in line with U.S. priorities for the region. And going back, to what Adam said, that China would probably occupy the bulk of U.S. attention, or should occupy the bulk of U.S. attention, Eastern Europe and Russia. And I think, those would be very important priorities for the U.S. policymakers. But one thing about the Middle East, that we have seen over and over with every administration, at least since Richard Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s, is that every U.S. administration, the George W. Bush's sort of, with the exception of that, has wanted to sort of, deprioritize or, reduce the extent of its engagement in the region. In the last, decade or so, with the rise of China on the global stage, the Middle East has also been sort of pushed to the margin by, or at least there's an argument by many folks in Washington that the Middle East should not be given that priority. But what we have seen, especially since October, the 7th, is that no matter what the desire or the thinking in Washington or other, Western and global capitals might be, the Middle East has a way of, grabbing the attention of people outside, usually not for very good reasons or not under very good circumstances. And I think given what has been happening since last year, since the October of 2023, is that the weakening of the Iran-led axis offers an opportunity to reorient the regional reality and to restructure the security arrangements and the balance of power in the region in a way that would cause less of a problem and liability for the U.S. And I think given especially at this moment the determination that Israel has shown, and given the makeup, the composition of the future administration, at least so far, in terms of some of the picks and nominees, we are likely going to see a desire or a willingness to seize on this particular momentum that we are seeing, right now. And so if that were to be seized, and if, the decline of the Iran-led axis is going to continue, that would bring about a new reality in terms of the, security architecture of the region, whether in the Gulf region, in the Levant, and possibly, in Iraq, that would be more favorable, or at least would be seen more favorable to U.S. interests and some of the other, regional partners and allies of the U.S. So the question is, would that be really capitalize on that opportunity that exists. And it depends really on how people in Washington would decide to go about it in terms of, from the US perspective. But I think it's a tempting moment and opportunity that people cannot disregard easily.
Absolutely. There are a few other questions in the chat. I'm thinking this is for Mustafa. The question is in Arabic. Do you expect that the incoming administration will be strict or will deal with the Houthis with determination with the incoming Trump administration, or will they continue their policy of placating and appeasement of the Houthi? And just in context for anyone who's watching, the general perception is that the Houthi is a non-state actor, is a what they call it in Arabic is that it's a spoiled militia, meaning that often we turn a blind eye on, or the international community has turned a blind eye on the Houthis' criminality inside Yemen and their human rights abuses, and have placated them at every UN agreement. So the issue is if this policy of appeasement is going to continue. Your point of view, Mustafa.
Well, just we have some expectation, and we don't know what's going on in the head of Trump or in his own cabinet. So we think there is two ways, or to continue what's done by Biden administration. It means combine the solution. Oops, sorry. So combine the both approach. It means continue to support the peace processes building, and the second one is the severe approach as a limit intervention, limited airstrikes only. But we don't know, maybe Trump decided to restore the US credibility and start with a strong entry in the international scene. Maybe he will choose the Yemen as new theater for this demonstration. And we should know that Houthi status changed. 5 or 10 years ago, it was just small threaten. It was just like a joke for some people who said. Now he is a serious risk and threat for the global economy. And it doesn't only concern US, European are concerned, Chinese and others, regional power, they are concerned by these threats. And the other thing that Houthi is engaged in Israel security. So there is a new things that we should think about. If Trump will not harm Houthis for US or European interest, he is engaged to protect Israel's, and I think they will take a way to do it. I mean, maybe Trump will be pushed to do something by Israelis, if not by Yemenis or by others actors.
Great, thank you so much. As we're coming to the end of the discussion, I just will give the opportunity for each of you to just give me a minute answer on this question. It's basically what would your key advice to the next US administration be regarding Yemen and the broader region? Regarding Yemen, Iran, and the broader region, what should be the primary focus, whether it's balancing great power competition or addressing the humanitarian crisis or countering the influence of armed groups like the Houthis while ensuring long-term stability and US strategic interests? And I will start with Adam.
I think the administration should certainly don't do any more harm, don't do anything worse to worsen the humanitarian situation. I think, as I mentioned as well that first and foremost of step 1, 2, and 3 is in the conflict in Gaza, and really as holistically as the incoming administration looks at the Middle East, has to look really hard at resources, at global allocation, where resources go, of how they've been consumed or reused from the Asia Pacific and the conflict between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and Russia, how the U.S. and Western industrial base can or cannot in the future support that. And I think as well, really, is the U.S. continuing to be a hostage to I use a strong word, a hostage to Israel. I think how it approaches that will really determine as well of what policies could be in Yemen. So I've only got a minute, but I'll leave it there.
Great. And perhaps next, Mustafa.
Well, thank you. I think just two ideas that non-state actors cannot bring stability. The second, that the war and the economy war are going to become a lifestyle in Yemen. So we should to intervene now. It's better, and we should not pay costly the price of the negligence when we think that there is some bad control area that we can leave it and take it as for itself. We should be more interventionist, not only military, not especially in military way, but humanitarian and economically and politically and diplomatically.
And last but not least, Mohammed.
Well, what I'm gonna say, is partly in agreement and also probably partly different from what Mustafa and Adam said. I would say, talking to people in the region is really important for the U.S. to understand and appreciate the value of its allies, and that extends to both state actors and non-state actors in places such as, Syria and Iraq, with the Kurds, for example. I think there is an opportunity to sort of redesign or create a new, regional security architecture that should include both state and non-state actors in various parts of the region. That should not, however, be interpreted as meaning waging war on Iran. I think there's an opportunity in light of, what has happened over the past year in particular that, that creates or, gives a chance for trying to have some sort of deals in the region, whether country specific or broader ones, in particular with Iran, in a way that would cease, destabilizing activities in some of the countries in the region. That would also, in particular, extend to the case of Syria, for example. There is, or there will be an opportunity for reaching some sort of arrangement in Syria that would, that could potentially or ideally freeze the conflict and maybe push toward some sort of political solution in line with UN Security Council 2245 resolution, and that should be really the roadmap for the future of that country in particular. But it's really important to realize, that a lot of the U.S. allies in the region have been unhappy and have been hurt by the U.S. treatment over, the past several years, and now there is an opportunity to sort of mend the fences and try to create a broader framework with the participation of these state and non-state actors in the region, and I think that should be really utilized.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thanks to all of our panelists today. Really appreciate your insights and contribution, and we look and thank you to our audience for engaging with us. And if you find these discussions and events helpful, please subscribe to us. And with that, our event is concluded, and have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.